So you need to be getting your notes out as we deal with the extension of European power. As long as that's still on the screen. Yep, that's okay. We saw in the video how John Green explained to us a little bit about imperialism and its impact and effects around the world. Who were some of the major countries that were involved in imperialism? Great Britain is one of the big ones. Yeah, who else? Not so much Russia. France was another one. Italy, yes. Some. Germany, a little bit maybe. Okay. But really Great Britain was probably the biggest one and extended their empire more than almost any other. And so as we get into today, talk about their extension, some of the areas that they are going to expand to. I want you to understand a few of the reasons why imperialism becomes so important during this time. One of those was a demand for materials. Why were countries demanding materials right now during this particular time period? Industrial Revolution. Okay, so we have specifically mentioned Great Britain. What is their big limitation? What is their big limitation that they have based off of their location?
Water.
Is water limitation? Okay, they're surrounded by water. So what does that mean for limitation and materials? They have to import a lot of stuff, specifically natural resources that they don't currently have. They're going to have plenty of water and steam power, but when it comes to coal, or when it comes to iron, when it comes to gold, when it comes to laborers, they're going to have to go find that somewhere else. And so they're not the only country that is going to have a high demand for materials. There's going to be others that are going to want stuff from other parts of the world. There's also nationalism that motivates people to develop into an imperial type country. What is the concept of nationalism? Give me a quick summary or concept. That's part of it. You're thinking more mercantilism, but mercantilism does tie in here. Kaylin? It may not. I may not have this one in here. This one's pretty short.
What was the Roman numeral title?
I don't remember. Okay. We're talking about the expansion of countries here. So, yeah.
Extension of European power.
I was close.
Okay, thanks.
Roman numeral 2.
Contrary to popular belief, I don't memorize my PowerPoints. I go more on concept, so I put it.
Which is odd because you follow them so well.
I put them in different words every time. I mean, I say it differently every time. Okay, so nationalism. Okay, what's the concept? What's the idea behind nationalism?
Isn't it like when everybody puts aside like their own background, just like all come together and be unified?
Yes. So you are doing whatever is necessary to promote the nation itself. So it doesn't matter what ethnic group you're a part of, what language you are a part of, what religious background, but you're going to do whatever's best for the flag. And that's nationalism. So when it comes to imperialism, countries that are wanting to dominate other countries or take advantage or to exercise your power over somebody else, that flag becomes really, really important. Part of the reason why we have a flag up here in the corner of our classroom, and I don't know how your homeroom works, but my homeroom, we do the pledge to the flag every day, is because we have a great respect and honor for our country and everything that flag represents. Now that's part of nationalism. Whether we come out and say that or not, it's the idea we're trying to unify under that flag. Now we're not going to sit here and force everybody to say the pledge to the flag, because that becomes more totalitarianism, which we'll get into later. Which I would not promote. But nationalism in the right perspective can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. Humanitarianism, what does that word mean? We've got a lot of isms here. Okay? When you hear somebody talking about a humanitarian effort, what do you think that's all about? What does it mean to be humane? Okay. Okay, things that are morally right, things that are going to benefit other people, things that are going to benefit society. So there were efforts here during imperialism to reach out to less advanced cultures and less advanced people to try to bring them some modern parts of life. So when they get into Africa, and let's just use Great Britain as a good example here. Great Britain goes into Africa and they see all these people that they are still using technology from 500 years ago. And you have guns and you have steam-powered boats and you have vaccines. What does your conscience want to do to help those people? Humanitarian, your conscience does not want you to enslave them. I hope. I know that's what they did, but I'm saying, what is your conscience? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so help those people out. You want to give them stuff that will help them be a better person or help their society be better. They do. Okay. So why did they get into wars? Why did they start fighting when?
And they realize that they don't
Okay.
need that, and they have stuff that they want.
Okay.
Do you understand?
Yeah. Yeah. So imagine this for a moment. If you have a group of people come in and tell you how to live your life when you are just fine the way that you are, and they expect you to make changes now, and they want you to live like them, is that going to go over well with you?
No.
No. Okay, you're teenagers. You don't want anybody telling you what to do, right?
That's accurate. I don't even want to.
Now, that does not mean that those people don't have your best interest in mind. You know, you think about the authorities that you have that you often struggle to obey and honor, your parents, your teachers. Oftentimes, when you look at their motives and the reason why they do things, is it in your best interest? Now, I realize there are exceptions, and there are times where we're all sinful. We do things that we shouldn't do. So there could be somebody that's doing it for the wrong reasons. But when you look at it, and especially as you get older and understand more about life, you look back and you say, okay, now I understand why my parents wouldn't let me go to this event or with these people. Or I look at a friend that I had in middle school, and I could never understand why my parents wouldn't let me go to his house. Like, seriously, it's not a big deal. Like, all my friends are going, and his dad's there, and, you know, it'll be fine. Well, I didn't understand the whole situation. And come to find out, when I got a little bit older, I don't know, something connected my brain. I figured out, well, his dad was in a very bad former marriage situation, and sometimes the families had some issues getting along. There were some things that went on in that house that were not God-honoring. There were some things that happened in that house that may or may not have been illegal. I'm not entirely sure. And come to find out now, that friend of mine in middle school, he has spent the good part of the last 12 years in jail because of some of the things that he learned from his family and that he was not trained well. And my parents didn't want me involved in that. I'm like, dude, I'm just going over there. I want to play video games over there. That's all I want to do. Well, I realize now that would have been a really bad situation for me to be part of. But in the short term, I didn't see it. And a lot of times, it's the same way with us. And when we look at the people in Africa, this is still one of the greatest debates out there, is should we just leave them alone and let them to their own devices, or should we try to help them out even if they don't want it because we think it's the best thing for them? And I'm not going to tell you, okay, that's a good point too. But then,
It's like, yeah, it's
okay,
like being a parent. You can tell your kids what they want to do, but I mean, they're still going to do it.
sure. True. Yeah. And that's part of what and that's part of what we're going to find out in Africa here, is that there's going to be a resistance to all the stuff that Europe tries to bring into Africa. But what do we see happen in India? Did they resist like we see in Africa? No.
They're actually happy.
India, they embrace it and they say, okay, well, rather than going through war and spending a whole bunch of money and lives, let's just go ahead and become British and embrace the whole European and British culture. Now, Christian missionaries were also another reason for imperialism. There was, not quite yet Jim Elliot. He's a little bit later on. There were a lot of missionaries who they wanted to go reach others with the gospel, and so they pushed politicians to go out and to spread their influence around other parts of the world. And many times it opened the door for many of these missionaries as countries like Britain, they get into India. Now that opens the door for a bunch of British missionaries to be able to go into India and be able to share the gospel there. I also hit on just a couple of key ideas and examples of imperialism. John Green mentioned this in his video as well. The Opium Wars was a war between Britain and China. And as the name indicates, it was over the concept of opium. So the Manchu dynasty in China had closed off China from the rest of the world for centuries. And they did not want to have any influence from outsiders. They wanted to be isolated on their own. Well, there were a couple of British opium dealers or opium suppliers that were allowed to smuggle into China. And they brought the stuff in. The Chinese people became addicted and they kept wanting more and more of it, and it just opened up this whole black market inside of China. So when the Chinese government started to find out about this, they tried to crack down on all of the drug trade going on in China. They tried to force out any sort of foreigners or foreign influence in China, and that's when war breaks out. Because China points the finger at Britain. Britain says, you got to control your own country, your own people, and there ends up being this war that happens. And Britain, with its advanced technology, was able to defeat China, and they forced China to open up their doors to westernization. Without China's cooperation, Great Britain says, we've defeated you, you're going to listen to us, we are going to make you more like the rest of the world. So everybody else come on in. And essentially, Britain opens the door here to China, and they say, everybody in, let's go. And here comes France, here comes America, here comes Spain, and everybody else. Question? Yeah. So, whose power was influenced in this case? It was Great Britain. They were exercising their imperialism over China, forcing their way of life on somebody else, showing their power. The Boxer Rebellion was part of the Chinese resistance. Now, the Boxers were also known by this name, the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. Okay, where else have we seen a fist represented in previous topics? No, not the French Revolution. Yes. The last topic, the Industrial Revolution.
Oh, 7 weeks war.
Nope.
No.
The thing with the factories and
Yes. Yes.
and they all
Yes.
put stuff in his one big fist.
Yes.
I don't remember what it's called.
Karl Marx, Marxism, the rise of the working class, the proletariat rising up to, as the common people would rise up to meet up the government, and they would defeat them as one unit. Well, so the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, okay, that was their society name. That became a little bit long. They became known as the Boxers. Okay, Righteous and Harmonious Fists. Righteous, harmonious, right here. Righteous, harmonious. Okay, meet them. All right, they're the Boxers. Okay, they're ready to fight if they have to in order to restore China to the way it once was. And so this is in some cases, a physical retaliation against all foreigners, all foreign ideas. So any concept, any idea that was not Chinese, they were going to try to physically remove out of China. In some ways, it seemed to work okay because people were scared to go into China. Foreign ideas all of a sudden left. And what ended up happening was the European countries had to step in to restore order and peace. It almost turned into full anarchy because you had the group of people that wanted all the foreigners out, and you had the foreigners resisting. And Europe steps in, and Great Britain being one of them, came to the rescue to help the Chinese government to restore order in their country. We get to Japan, and in Japan there is the rise of the Japanese Empire. So Japan has always been kind of in the shadows of China. Nobody's really taken Japan seriously, including Russia. Well, I guess we're not quite to Russia yet. We'll talk about China first. So Japan is on the rise. They are adopting and embracing a lot of the Western culture and the Industrial Revolution. They are building themselves an empire. And China looks at Japan like their little stepbrother, and they don't want anything to do with them. So Japan knows that they've got to defeat China in order to gain any world recognition. So that's exactly what they're going to do here in the Sino-Japanese War. So this is China versus Japan, 1894 to 1895. Just a perspective date. I'm not going to make you memorize that. But Japan launches an attack into China, trying to prove themselves worthy of the global stage here, trying to prove themselves that they belong with all the other imperial countries. And it broke out as a result of a disagreement over Korea, and the fact that both countries wanted control and wanted to have influence over Korea, and China said, that's our territory, and Japan said, we need to have that territory, we want that territory. And at the end of the war, when Japan wins, they are going to, yeah, that's, well,
But they don't have, actually they don't have it in 1894 is not Korea, it's different name. I know that.
so
But they said Korea is
they didn't have control over Korea. They wanted control over Korea. Right. So Japan ends up, because they defeat China, Japan ends up asserting itself as an imperial power. And it made sure that Korea was not going to be dominated by Chinese government and Chinese influence, and Korea was going to be allowed to govern themselves. So,
Wait. I'm confused about when Korea got involved.
so
They were fighting over Korea.
they were fighting over control of Korea. China,
Japan was trying to take over Japan. Yeah.
Japan. Okay, I think that. So, follow my logic and don't talk. All right. If we lose track, then we miss out on what's happening. I think there's a lot of other things happening in here that we tend to lose focus. So Japan was the little stepbrother to China. In order to get themselves national recognition, they knew they had to defeat China. The argument and the reason why the war broke out was an argument over Korea and the fact that China wanted to dominate Korea. They wanted to take over and make it part of their country and part of their government. Yes?
When did they launch an attack? In 1890?
I'm about there.
Oh, well, you said that, so I just thought, okay.
Yeah. So when China wanted to take over Korea, Japan stepped in and took that as an opportunity to attack China, to defend and to help support Korea and to make sure that China did not dominate over Korea. Okay, we follow me now? They wanted a free Korea.
China wants Korea and Japan wants
So-
to defend Korea.
Yeah, the argument was over Korea. Not that Japan wanted to take over Korea, but the argument was over the territory that Korea owned. Korea was just caught in the middle. They didn't.
Like they didn't just pick Japan and fight with them.
Who didn't pick Japan?
Korea. They didn't go fight with Japan.
They probably helped support with Japan, yes, to defend their own territory, yes. But as a result of this war, the bigger picture here, okay, big picture, Japan has defeated China. Japan is this size. China is bigger than this picture holds. So little tiny island of Japan now asserts himself as a major world power because they have taken down one of the top nations that the world recognizes as a big power. So
How does someone that tiny do that? Like, what the
that's what the rest of the world was asking. Well, we've overlooked Japan for so long. How in the world did they defeat them? So when Japan conquers or wins over China, now they didn't take over the entire country, so don't think that China ceased to exist because they still did exist. They signed a peace treaty to stop the fighting. Japan sets their sights on something even bigger. They go on to Russia. It's actually, because it worked, it became brilliant. Had they lost, yes, probably would have been not a good idea. But they go to Russia and they attack Russia. Any idea why they would want to go after Russia? Okay, it's big.
Don't they have a lot of land and don't they own a lot?
Okay, that's a true statement. That's not going to be necessarily one of the reasons why they go after them. Keep in mind, the biggest thing that Japan wants right now, they do want resources. They also want imperial recognition. They want to be recognized as a global power.
Would it be because, like, Russia doesn't have that many allies, so they're trying to get in?
Not necessarily.
Get them more publicity, like that'll get them more like
With who?
Britain. The world.
Okay, is Russia an Asian or European country? It's kind of both, right? So, I know, but yeah, it's considered Eurasia for those of you that took geography with me last year. So we talked about Russia both in the Europe section and in the Asia section. So if they conquer China, who's going to recognize them as a global power?
Everybody.
Well, to some extent, but mostly Asian countries. Europe is going to recognize when they conquer Russia and they go into battle with Russia. So the Russo-Japanese War was all about speaking to the European countries and saying, we can take down anybody no matter how big they are. And that's exactly what they do. Now, this is kind of a side note and a preview to U.S. history for you. I know you're pumped. In this war, this was causing some major global issues between the United States and other European countries. And so they wanted to get this war over with. So Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States, steps into this and he negotiates the peace treaty between these two countries. These two countries were not really ready to sign a peace treaty. And Roosevelt comes in and he sits them down and he says, and I almost picture this, and I think there might be a political cartoon where he is like holding his hand on the heads of each one of these leaders saying, you need to talk this out and figure this out. I'm going to make sure of it. He actually wins a Nobel Peace Prize for his negotiations in this treaty. Unfortunately, the treaty is no good. It's poorly written. It was put together too quickly. Neither side was happy with the treaty, and so everybody kind of walks away from this angry, upset, except for Theodore Roosevelt, who thinks he's a hero. And he gets a Nobel Peace Prize for the whole thing. So, no, he did not. He did not give it to himself.
Oh, it's just like more one-sided or something?
That what?
I feel like
Make them
it's,
mad about it?
I think it's like
Okay.
whenever you and your sister like fight in the back of the car and it's like no, and then your parents like shut up or I'm like
It-
kinda like what
It's
They're like, apologize.
yeah,
it's
it's
like I'm sorry.
right, exactly. It's like both of you say, I'm sorry, and neither one of you mean it, and nobody's happy when you walk away. Okay? Yeah, except the parents. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we know how it works. Okay. All right, now let's talk Africa. And this is part of where we're going to get into our simulation today. So Africa goes for slave labor. Many of these nations here want to get the slaves from Africa. They want to distribute them to other places around the world. And that's really one of the biggest things that these imperial countries desire from Africa. The slave trade is in full bloom here from 1700 to 1850. That was like the peak of a lot of the slave trade that's going on. It's okay, you can ignore that. And we talked about the slave trade a little bit in the Industrial Revolution. Many of these traders were purchasing slaves from other other African tribes. So while the slave trade was a really bad thing, it was also part of the culture of Africa, where these other tribes would sell people from tribe to tribe. And so when they were into war and they would capture people, they did not kill them. Most of the time they would sell them off to another tribe as a slave in that tribe. And so when they saw the white man come and they wanted to take them off on a boat, they didn't think much of it to sell them there because it was still part of the common practice. Now, that was not necessarily everybody that did that, but that was pretty commonplace. And a lot of times, they were treated much better in their own culture than what they were when they were brought into the white slave trade. David Livingstone. He was one of the first Europeans to explore Africa. He was a missionary. And so he is given the credit for exploring the interior portions of Africa as he tried to reach many of the African people with the gospel. But what? I don't know. I don't know. So David Livingstone took the gospel to many people here. Cecil John Rhodes, he is known as the empire builder because he was one of those that came in and began establishing imperialism inside of Africa. And so as he continued to promote...
Is Rhode Island named after him?
No. But you ever heard of the Rhodes Scholar Award?
No.
Okay, what is... Yeah, you know what that is? So the Rhodes Scholar Award is given to some of the smartest people in our country. And Rhodes, it's named after him. So the Rhodes Scholar, I cannot remember. If somebody's on Google and you want to look up what the prize is for the Rhodes Scholar, I believe it's a free education, and I think there's also more cash prize involved in it. Look up the Rhodes Scholar Award. Tell me what you find.
If you're already the smartest person, then you've probably already been through school. Why do you need more
It's usually given to people that are either still in college or headed to college or maybe pursuing higher degrees.
Something I've noticed about a lot of very intelligent people is that they don't ever want to stop learning.
Yeah.
So, odds are...
You find anything on it?
That sort of thing, and they got
Oh, so they're going to be a professional student. Gotcha.
Yeah, type on,
Okay.
or click on that one. And
Like, not good at it.
Scholarship for
Yep. It is one of the...
professional sleeper.
It's one of the most prestigious scholarships that's offered. I guess it doesn't say on there.
You know what's really cool? They have a scholarship for like coloring in a coloring book.
Really?
Yeah.
So for those of you over here that are struggling to stay focused, you can either move or get refocused. Okay. Considering that this stuff is going to be pretty significant. So a couple results here as we finish out the idea of imperialism. First of all, a negative result is it exploited a lot of weaker nations, took advantage of them, didn't give them opportunities just as a collective group of people. It also pushed a lot of native cultures backwards. Because of the resistance toward the Europeans that came and tried to force them into industrial or a modern world, They just flat out refused. I think this graphic right here helps to represent that, especially with Africa. As you can see, all that has been dug out of Africa and taken over to the United States and to Europe, leaving Africa with no resources and nothing to gain from it. So there's a lot of resentment that builds up towards the imperial nations. It's part of the reason why a lot of people do not like the British. A lot of the reason why people don't like the Americans. Many people around the world struggle with these countries that came in, took advantage of weaker people for their own gain. So morally, it does seem wrong. Culturally, or I guess as a nation, was it acceptable?
No, yeah. Because they just wanted power. It wasn't really about morals.
Okay, it was more,
What you could get.
yeah, more about building the country, not necessarily a whole lot of moral motivation in any of this, sure. What's coming next?
World War II.
Before World War II, we have to go with World War I. Okay, thank you. Now, which countries are going to be involved in World War I?
America and Germany and Britain
These countries right here, right?
and Africa.
Yeah, Africa's not going to be involved in World War I. I mean, there's a little bit of fighting that spills into here, but so these countries that dismantled Africa are going to be the ones that are going to be fighting then among themselves in World War I. So you can look at it two different ways. Some people will look at that as the imperialism led to some of the fighting in World War I. Other people look at it as the imperialism gave the resources for countries to survive and to be able to make it through World War I. Depends on your outlook.
Or if we wouldn't have had it, everybody would have been happy.
Let's look at the positive side of things. A lot of internal improvements are made inside of both the imperialistic countries and those that were touched by imperialism. Even though a lot of the resources were harvested out of places like Africa and India, there were a lot of improvements that were brought into those countries. Things like vaccines, things like running water, things like steam power, and things that made life better. Now again, we talked about that earlier where sometimes they didn't want those things, but there were improvement efforts. Missionaries as well. The gospel was spread in tremendous ways that would not have happened without these countries extending their influence into places like Africa and India. And with them, many of those missionaries brought modern elements of society. And one of the key differences between the missionaries that came and the other colonists that may have come and encountered African tribes or people in India is these missionaries would come showing them new technology or showing them parts of modern society and give them more options of, do you want to try this? Is this something that you would like? And then they would use that as an opportunity to build a relationship with them and then to bring them into a more modern society.
I feel like that's what other people should have done instead of just like forcing on them whenever they wanted and not gonna happen.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of that stems from, that's how the relationship started. And then when we found out that there was gold or there were diamonds or there was something we wanted, we were too impatient and they just went and they took it. Yeah, there's a lot of similarities the way the United States treated the Native Americans to what we see here. Partially because you look at the timeline, the idea of imperialism is right in the middle of the 1800s. And so that's where a lot of the Native American tribes are forced off their reservations. They're forced out of their lands and they're put somewhere else because imperialism was the mainstream idea of most governments of the day. Now, William Carey was one of the most famous of all the missionaries that came. William Carey, he went to India. And I believe it was William Carey correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe he went for 9 years without seeing a single person come to Christ. And he just continued to work. And I think he may have also buried 2 or 3 wives during the course of his time ministering to the people of India. And it took, they were not like simultaneous wives. All right, these were like one after another. Yeah, yeah. Well, not necessarily, but William Carey was in India. Hudson Taylor, he's the one that went to China. Yeah, what did Hudson Taylor do in China? Anybody remember? So Hudson Taylor, well, let's think about the Chinese culture. What did the Boxers specifically want to try to do in China? They want to do what?
They wanted to
Eliminate all the new people, all the foreigners, foreign ideas. Well, was Hudson Taylor Chinese?
No.
No. So he transformed his mannerisms, the way he dressed, even his haircut, to match those of the Chinese. So he would try to fit in with the Chinese people as much as possible because of the fact that they were rebelling against anything that was foreign. He knew there was no chance of giving them the gospel, no chance of them coming to Christ if he looked like an American. And so he went, he lived among the people, he learned the language, he made himself look as much as possible like Chinese. Of course, without any kind of plastic surgery.
He didn't change himself.
Well, he dressed like them, he talked like them, he grew his hair the way that they did. No, he couldn't do anything about that. But just those other steps generated a friendship with the Chinese that he would not have normally had.
So there's a missionary at my church that goes to like very like Muslim populated areas, and he like goes like gets super tan and stuff, and like wears their clothes like before he goes, just so it's like he doesn't